When a struggling single mother smuggles her toddler into Seoul's most heavily guarded mansion, the last thing she expects is for her baby to reach for the tattooed mafia boss like he's family, especially when that man has a reputation for making problems disappear without a trace. Amina Clarke is 4 weeks into her position as a maid in one of Seoul's most secretive estates, 2 months behind on her student loan payments, and approximately 40 seconds from a complete disaster. When her childcare arrangement falls apart at the last minute, she makes an impossible decision: hide her 18-month-old son, Kai, in the service quarters and hope he stays silent during her shift. But hope isn't a strategy. When Kai's delighted laughter echoes through the polished corridors, it reaches the attention of Ma Joon-Ryeol, the ruthless mafia boss who controls the mansion and runs Seoul's criminal underworld with calculated brutality. The entire staff goes rigid. Everyone understands what happens when you break his rules. Amina braces for the end: termination, deportation, possibly something far worse. What she isn't prepared for is the unthinkable: her son, who cries around new faces, who clings to her like a lifeline in unfamiliar places, reaching out tiny hands toward this dangerous man's tattooed neck with absolute trust. In that heartbeat, everything changes. A toddler's impossible recognition, a hardened criminal's unguarded shock, a desperate mother's reality shattered and remade. This is the story of how the most unexpected connection became the thing that transformed them all. Hey family, before this story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Amina spent the entire night waiting for the hammer to fall. She'd been escorted back to the service quarters by a stone-faced guard who said nothing, only gestured for her to collect Kai and leave the main house. No termination letter, no explanation, just silence, the kind that felt like a held breath before a scream. She packed her few belongings in the tiny room she'd been assigned, Kai sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, blissfully unaware that his mother's hands were shaking. Every footstep in the hallway made her flinch. Every distant voice made her heart slam against her ribs. By morning, she'd convinced herself of 2 possibilities. Either she'd be quietly dismissed with enough severance to get home, or she'd simply disappear, like the rumors whispered about in the service quarters. People who crossed Ma Joon-Ryeol didn't get second chances. The knock came at 7 sharp. Amina opened the door expecting security. Instead, she found an elegant woman in her 50s wearing a tailored gray suit, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "Ms. Clarke," the woman said in perfect English, "Mr. Ma requests your presence in his private office, immediately." The walk through the mansion felt like a funeral procession. Amina had only ever cleaned the public-facing rooms, the endless marble, the museum-quality art, the spaces designed to intimidate visiting rivals. Now she was being led through corridors she'd never seen, past guards who watched her with curiosity rather than contempt, deeper into the heart of the estate. They stopped before massive double doors made of dark wood, carved with intricate patterns that looked like dragons mid-flight. "He's waiting," the woman said, then disappeared before Amina could ask a single question. Amina's hand hovered over the door handle. Through the carved wood, she could hear nothing, no movement, just that terrible, anticipatory silence again. She thought of Kai safely with the cook's assistant who had volunteered to watch him. At least he'd be protected, whatever happened next. She pushed open the door. The office was nothing like she expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a private garden, morning light streaming across shelves of books, and a desk that looked more like an antique than a workspace. And behind that desk sat Ma Joon-Ryeol, the dragon tattoo visible above his open collar, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to run. "Sit," he said. Not a request. Amina sat. He studied her for a long moment, and she forced herself to hold his gaze, even as every survival instinct screamed at her to look away, to make herself small, to disappear. Finally, he spoke. "Your son has excellent instincts." Amina blinked. Of all the things she'd prepared herself to hear, that wasn't on the list. "Most people fear me," he continued, his voice soft but absolute. "Your child looked at me and saw something else. That interests me." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Miss Clarke, what do you see?" If you're hooked, hit that subscribe button, because this story is just getting started. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. 3 hours later, Amina stood in front of what Ma Joon-Ryeol had casually referred to as the garage apartment, wondering if she'd hallucinated the entire morning. This wasn't an apartment. This was someone's fever dream of luxury crammed into a 3-car garage. Heated floors, a kitchen with appliances she'd only seen in magazines, a bedroom with a crib that probably cost more than her entire semester's tuition, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the estate's private lake. "You'll start at $10,000 a month," he'd said, as if that were a normal salary for someone whose previous job involved scrubbing toilets. "Your official title is personal assistant. Your actual job is to tell me the truth." Amina stared at him. "The truth about what?" "Everything." He'd slid a contract across the desk. "The people I meet, the deals they offer, whether they're lying or desperate or plotting something. You have instincts. I watched you assess every guard who walked past you in the hallway. I need someone who sees what I might miss." It was insane. It was dangerous. It was more money than she'd ever imagined having. She'd signed. Now, watching Kai toddle around the apartment, touching everything with sticky fingers and pure joy, she was still trying to process the surreal turn her life had taken. The knock on the door made her jump. She opened it to find a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a tactical training manual by way of a fashion magazine. Mid-30s, athletic build, with sharp eyes that cataloged everything in a single glance. She wore black jeans and a fitted jacket that couldn't quite hide what Amina suspected was a shoulder holster. "I'm Minji," the woman said in lightly accented English, offering a brief smile. "Your nanny." Amina must have looked as confused as she felt, because Minji's smile widened slightly. "Mr. Ma doesn't do things halfway. You need someone to watch Kai while you're working. You get someone who can also make sure nothing happens to him." She glanced past Amina to where Kai was attempting to climb onto the sofa. "I have 2 certifications in early childhood education and 1 in close protection. Before you ask, yes, I'm armed. No, your son will never see the weapon. And yes, I actually enjoy finger painting." Amina asked, a slightly hysterical sound that she couldn't quite contain. "This is my life now." "Could be worse," Minji said, stepping inside and immediately crouching to Kai's level as he toddled over, curious. "You could still be scrubbing floors." She looked up at Amina, and something almost kind flickered in those sharp eyes. "Mr. Ma doesn't bring people into his inner circle lightly. Whatever he saw in you, it's real. Don't doubt it." But as Amina watched this former special operative expertly engage her son with a toy car, all she could think was that she'd walked through a door she could never close again. Amina had exactly 6 days to settle into her new reality before Ma Joon-Ryeol decided to throw her into the deep end. "You're coming with me tonight," he said, appearing at her apartment door at 5 in the evening wearing a black suit that probably cost more than her old car. "There's a dinner meeting. I need your eyes." She'd looked down at her jeans and sweater. "I'm not exactly dressed for—" "Already handled." He nodded toward a garment bag hanging on her doorknob that she hadn't noticed. "Be ready in an hour." The dress was midnight blue, elegant and understated in a way that probably meant it was obscenely expensive. Amina had stared at herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back. She'd come to Seoul as a struggling student. Now she looked like she belonged in the same room as people who decided the fate of the city's underworld. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't have prices on the menu because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. Private room, ambient lighting, and sitting across the table from them, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold eyes. "Mr. Ma," the man said in Korean, which Joon-Ryeol translated quietly for her, "I'm honored you accepted my invitation." Park Jin-soo. That's what Joon-Ryeol had told her in the car, a businessman with connections to 3 rival organizations, trying to broker a truce, or so he claimed. Amina watched Park as he spoke, noting the way his hands moved, the micro-expressions that flickered across his face when Joon-Ryeol mentioned specific terms. She'd spent years reading professors during office hours, learning to distinguish genuine concern from attempts at manipulation when arguing for grade changes. This wasn't so different, except the stakes here weren't a letter grade, they were lives. "He keeps looking at the door," Amina murmured in English during a pause when Park excused himself to take a call. "Every 30 seconds, like he's waiting for something." Joon-Ryeol's expression didn't change, but his hand moved subtly beneath the table, and she realized he was texting someone. When Park returned, his smile was wider, more nervous. "I'm afraid something's come up," Joon-Ryeol said smoothly, standing. "We'll have to continue this discussion another time." In the car, he finally looked at her. "My security just found 2 men positioned in the alley behind the restaurant." Park was stalling, waiting for them to get into position. He paused. "You saw it before I did." "I saw him acting like a student who plagiarized his essay and was waiting for the professor to call him out." Amina's hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "I didn't know it meant—" "You don't need to know what it means. You just need to see it." His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "You did well." Amina looked out the window at Seoul's glittering lights, wondering when exactly her life had become one where noticing a man's nervous glances might have saved lives. Probably the same moment her son had reached for a dragon tattoo and changed everything. "Does it get easier?" she asked quietly. "No," Joon-Ryeol said, "but you get stronger." The call came at 2 in the morning, Minji's voice tense but controlled. "Mr. Ma needs you in his office, now." Amina had thrown on clothes and run across the estate grounds, heart hammering, expecting crisis. Instead, she found Joon-Ryeol alone in his dimly lit office, shirt discarded, blood seeping through a white bandage around his left shoulder. "It's nothing," he said before she could speak. "A disagreement that got physical. The doctor's already been and gone." But his face was pale, jaw tight with pain he was trying to hide, and his hands were unsteady as he attempted to rewrap the bandage that had come loose. "Let me," Amina said, moving forward before she could second-guess herself. He went still as she approached, and she realized this might be the first time she'd voluntarily entered his space rather than being summoned into it. Up close, she could see the full scope of the tattoos she'd only glimpsed before. The dragon that started at his neck writhed down across his chest and shoulder, scales rendered in such detail they seemed to shimmer in the low light. Peonies bloomed along his ribs, their petals touching the dragon's tail. Her hands were gentle as she cleaned the wound, a knife slash, shallow but angry, and began rewrapping the bandage with steady precision. "My mother was a nurse," she said softly, answering his unasked question. "She made sure I knew the basics." "Your mother," he said, and something in his voice made her look up. "She would not approve of where you are now." "No," Amina agreed. "She'd have a lot to say about it. She passed 3 years ago, but I still hear her voice sometimes, telling me I'm being reckless." She secured the bandage, but didn't step back. Why the dragon? The question hung between them. She half expected him to shut down, to retreat behind the cold mask he showed the world. Instead, he touched the scales near his collarbone, almost reverent. "In my family, dragons were protectors, guardians of what mattered most." His voice was quiet, distant. "My father had me marked when I was 17, the day I officially entered his organization. He said it would remind me why we did what we did, that every act of violence, every ruthless decision was to protect our own. And did it? Amina asked. Remind you? For a long time, yes. His eyes met hers, and she saw something raw in them. Then my father was killed by someone he'd trusted, someone he'd protected, and I learned that dragons can't save everyone. Sometimes they can only burn the world down around them. Amina's hand moved without conscious thought, fingers hovering just above the dragon's head on his neck, the exact spot where Kai had touched him weeks ago. My son saw a protector, not a monster. Children don't lie about things like that. His hand caught hers, holding it against the ink. His skin was warm beneath her palm, his pulse steady despite the pain he must be feeling. Your son, he said, has better instincts than most adults I know. In the darkness of the office, with blood on her hands and a dangerous man's secrets spreading between them like the petals of an ink-black flower, Amina realized she was no longer afraid of him. She was afraid of how much she was beginning to understand him. Amina returned to her apartment 2 hours earlier than expected, the meeting with the finance minister's aide having ended abruptly when the man received an urgent call. She was mentally cataloging everything she had observed, the nervous energy, the way he'd avoided direct eye contact when discussing offshore accounts, when she heard something that made her stop short at her door. Laughter. Kai's bright, unrestrained giggling, the kind he only made when something delighted him completely. And beneath it, a deeper sound, a man's voice making exaggerated sound effects. She opened the door as quietly as possible and froze at the threshold. Ma Joon-Ryeol, Seoul's most feared crime lord, was on his hands and knees on her living room floor. His suit jacket was draped over the couch, his perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled, and he was making what could only be described as dinosaur noises, while Kai rode on his back, shrieking with joy. Min-ji sat on the sofa, barely concealing her smile behind a cup of tea. "Rawr," Joon-Ryeol growled, crawling in a circle while Kai bounced and clapped his small hands against the dragon tattoo visible above his collar. "The mighty dragon is under attack by the fierce warrior." Kai grabbed a handful of hair and tugged, and instead of the violence Amina had seen him capable of, Joon-Ryeol just adjusted his path, making the game more elaborate. "I should intervene," Amina said softly to Min-ji, unable to move. "You really shouldn't," Min-ji murmured back. "This is the 4th round. Your son is a tyrant, and somehow Mr. Ma hasn't noticed your home." As if summoned by her words, Joon-Ryeol looked up and Amina watched something fascinating happen. For just a fraction of a second, she saw pure panic flash across his face, the expression of someone caught doing something they weren't supposed to. Then it was gone, replaced by careful neutrality as he slowly sat up, Kai still clinging to his shoulders. "You're back early," he said, as if this were a perfectly normal situation. "Clearly," Amina replied, fighting the smile that wanted to break free. Kai, oblivious to any awkwardness, leaned forward and pressed a sticky kiss to Joon-Ryeol's cheek before demanding, "More! Dragon, more!" Something softened in Joon-Ryeol's expression, something that made Amina's breath catch. He looked at Kai with such unguarded tenderness that she finally understood what her son had seen that first day. Not the monster everyone feared, not the ruthless boss who commanded an empire, just a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be someone's safe place. "I should go," he said, gently disentangling Kai and standing, retrieving his jacket with as much dignity as he could muster. "I have a meeting." But as he passed Amina at the door, he paused. "He asked where you were. I told him you were working. He asked if I could stay until you came back." His voice dropped lower. I couldn't tell him no. After he left, Amina sank onto the couch next to Min-ji, watching Kai play with the toy cars scattered across the floor. "Has this happened before?" she asked. "3 times this week. Always finds an excuse to stop by. Always ends up on the floor." She glanced at Amina, something knowing in her expression. For what it's worth, I've worked for Mr. Ma for 6 years. I've never seen him like this with anyone." Amina pulled Kai into her lap, breathing in his baby shampoo scent, and tried to ignore the way her heart had started beating differently whenever Joon-Ryeol was near. The text came through on a Tuesday afternoon when Amina was reviewing shipping manifests in Joon-Ryeol's office, Kai napping in a portable crib Min-ji had set up in the corner. Unknown number. But she knew that pattern of speech, that particular way of phrasing things. "Amina, I heard you're in Seoul. We need to talk. I made mistakes. I want to make things right. Marcus." She stared at the screen until the words blurred. Marcus, the man who'd promised her forever during their last semester, the man who'd disappeared the week after she told him she was pregnant, blocking her number and transferring to a different university. The man who'd left her scrambling to finish her degree while working 3 jobs, who'd never once asked about his son. Bad news? She looked up to find Joon-Ryeol watching her, his expression sharp with concern. "Old news," she said, setting the phone face down. "Nothing important." But her hands were shaking, and he noticed everything. The second text came an hour later, then a third, then a fourth, each more insistent than the last. Marcus had somehow found out where she worked, what she was doing, and seemed to think that entitled him to a conversation. "I know you're working for someone important now. I can help you. We should meet, for Kai's sake." That last line made her want to throw the phone across the room, for Kai's sake, as if he'd ever once considered their son. She didn't notice Joon-Ryeol had moved until he was beside her chair, reading over her shoulder. "Who is this?" His voice was dangerously soft. "No one," she said quickly. "Just someone from my past who doesn't understand that's where he belongs." Kai's father. It wasn't a question. Amina nodded, hating how small she felt in that moment, how the past could reach across an ocean and still make her feel like the scared, abandoned girl she'd been. Joon-Ryeol held out his hand. "Your phone. You don't need to—" "Your phone, Amina." She handed it to him, watching as he typed something quickly and hit send. Then he blocked the number, added it to some kind of blacklist, and set the phone back on her desk. "What did you say?" she asked. "That if he contacts you again, through any means, he'll discover exactly how permanent a disappearance can be." He said it calmly, as if discussing the weather, "and that you are under my protection, which means he is now very far outside his depth." Amina should have been horrified, should have told him that was excessive, that she could handle it herself. Instead, she felt something inside her that had been wound tight for 3 years finally loosen. "Thank you," she whispered. He crouched beside her chair, meeting her eyes at the same level. "You don't thank someone for doing what should have been done from the beginning. He abandoned you when you needed him most. That kind of cowardice doesn't deserve second chances." His hand covered hers briefly, warm and steady. "You're not alone anymore. Neither of you are." Later, after he'd returned to his calls and Kai had woken up babbling, Amina checked her phone. No new messages, just silence where Marcus's demands had been. For the first time since she'd arrived in Seoul, she felt like she could finally breathe without waiting for the other shoe to drop. The explosion shattered the illusion of safety at exactly 11:47 p.m. Amina had been reading in bed, Kai asleep beside her, when the first blast turned the night into fire and screaming. The windows rattled but held. Then came the gunfire, sharp cracks that made her blood turn to ice. She grabbed Kai, still mercifully sleeping through the chaos, and hit the floor, crawling toward the reinforced panic room Min-ji had shown her the first week. "Just in case," Min-ji had said. "It'll never happen, but just in case." The apartment door burst open before she reached safety. Amina's scream died in her throat when she saw Min-ji, gun drawn, face grim. "We need to move, now. They breached the east perimeter." "Who—" Explanations later, survival now. They made it halfway across the grounds before the second explosion lit up the main house like a dying star. Amina stumbled, and Minji caught her, practically dragging her toward the reinforced garage that served as a secondary safe room. Inside, chaos. Staff members huddled together, some bleeding, all terrified. And in the center of it all, barking orders into his phone with deadly calm, was Joon-Ryeol. His eyes found her immediately, and something like relief flashed across his face before the mask of control returned. He crossed the space in 3 strides, his hands moving over her and Kai with swift efficiency, checking for injuries. "You're okay," he said, and it sounded like a vow he was making to himself. "What's happening?" "The Choi family. They've been planning this for months." His jaw tightened. "I didn't see it coming fast enough." Another explosion, closer this time. Kai woke up crying, and Amina pressed him against her chest, trying to muffle the sound even though it didn't matter anymore. Joon-Ryeol's phone lit up. He answered, listened, and his expression went cold in a way that made Amina's stomach drop. "They're in the house," he said quietly, looking for something specific. His eyes met hers. "Looking for you." The words didn't make sense. "Me? Why would they—" "Because they've been watching. They know what you mean to me." He said it simply, as if it were obvious, as if the entire underworld hadn't already figured out what Amina was only beginning to understand herself. Minji moved to the weapons cache on the far wall, and suddenly the garage felt less like a shelter and more like a fortress preparing for siege. "I'm getting you out," Joon-Ryeol said, already moving toward a hidden exit Amina had never noticed. "There's a car waiting 2 blocks away. Minji will take you to a safe house across the city." "What about you?" He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something fierce and final. "I'm ending this, tonight." "Joon-Ryeol." He cupped her face with both hands, heedless of the blood on his knuckles, heedless of the dozen people watching. "Keep him safe," he said, pressing his forehead briefly against hers. "That's all that matters." Then he was gone, disappearing back toward the burning mansion with 4 armed guards, leaving Amina with the terrifying certainty that she might never see him again. Minji gripped her arm. "We go, now." But as they emerged into the smoke-filled night, Amina looked back at the flames consuming the only place she'd ever felt protected, and realized with stunning clarity that somewhere between scrubbing floors and reading faces and watching a dangerous man play dragon with her son, she'd fallen in love. And she might have figured it out too late. The safe house was a sterile apartment in a high-rise across the city, all clean lines and impersonal furniture. Amina spent 3 hours pacing while Minji fielded calls, and Kai finally cried himself into exhausted sleep on an unfamiliar couch. No word, no updates, just silence that felt like a countdown to devastation. At 3 a.m., Minji's phone finally rang. She answered, listened, and her shoulders dropped with visible relief. "It's over," she said quietly. "Mr. Ma is alive." Amina's knees buckled. She caught herself against the wall, hand pressed to her mouth, trying to breathe through the overwhelming rush of emotion. "Where is he?" "Coming here," he insisted. Minji's expression softened. Against medical advice, apparently. He arrived 20 minutes later, and Amina had to physically stop herself from running to him. He looked like he'd walked through hell, suit torn and blood-stained, a fresh cut above his eyebrow, bruises already forming along his jaw. But he was alive. He was standing. He was here. "You're hurt," she said, the words inadequate for the terror that had been clawing at her chest for hours. "I've had worse." His eyes moved past her to where Kai slept, and something in his expression cracked. "He's safe." "Because of you." Joon-Ryeol shook his head slowly. "They came for you because of me, because I was careless enough to let them see what you meant." He moved closer, and she could see the weight of it in his eyes, the guilt, the rage, the fear he'd been carrying. "I thought I could keep you separate from that world. I was wrong." "What happened?" Amina asked. "At the house." His jaw tightened. I made it very clear what happens to people who threaten what's mine. The Choi family won't be a problem anymore. He said it flatly, without pride or remorse, just stating a fact. Amina should have been horrified by the implication, should have recoiled from the violence he'd clearly unleashed. Instead, she thought of Kai sleeping peacefully because this man had stood between them and destruction and felt only gratitude. "You called me yours," she said quietly. He went very still. "I did. In front of everyone, you said they knew what I meant to you."
Yes, no hesitation, no deflection. Amina closed the distance between them, careful of his injuries, and placed her hand over his heart. Beneath her palm, his pulse hammered despite his calm exterior. "I spent 3 hours thinking you were dead," she whispered, "thinking I'd never get to tell you that Kai isn't the only one who sees something in you that the world doesn't. That somewhere along the way, you became the person I trust most. That when you told me I wasn't alone anymore, I felt it, because I feel the same way about you." His hand covered hers, holding it against his chest. "Amina, you're a monster to your enemies," she continued, "but to us, you're home." He kissed her then, gentle despite the violence he'd just survived, his bloodied hands cradling her face like she was something precious. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. "I will burn down the world before I let anything happen to either of you," he said. And it wasn't a threat, it was a promise. "I know, that's what dragons do." 6 months later, the garden had become Kai's kingdom. Amina watched from the renovated terrace as her son, now running more than toddling, chased butterflies through the flowering peonies that Joon-Ryeol had planted specifically because Kai loved their colors. The mansion had been rebuilt, stronger than before, with a wing dedicated entirely to family, their family. "He's going to track mud everywhere," Joon-Ryeol said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of tea. He'd shed the suit jacket hours ago, sleeves rolled up, the dragon visible and unashamed in the afternoon light. "Probably," Amina agreed, accepting the tea. "Minji will have opinions." "Minji already has opinions. She texted me a list this morning." But he was smiling, that soft expression he wore now when he thought no one was watching. The expression that had become more frequent than the cold mask he'd once shown the world. Kai spotted them and came running, arms outstretched. "Appa! Up!" The word still made Amina's breath catch. Appa. Daddy. Kai had started saying it 3 months ago, unprompted, as if the title had always belonged to Joon-Ryeol. And the first time he'd said it, Amina had watched the most dangerous man in Seoul's underworld stand completely still, undone by a single word from a child who saw past everything to the truth underneath. Joon-Ryeol swept Kai up effortlessly, and the boy immediately grabbed for the dragon tattoo, tracing the scales like he'd done 100 times before. "Dragon time?" Kai asked hopefully. "After dinner," Joon-Ryeol negotiated. "And after you let your mother check if those are actually flowers in your pockets or just very suspicious mud clumps." Kai giggled and buried his face in Joon-Ryeol's neck, leaving a dirt smudge that would absolutely ruin his shirt. Neither of them cared. Amina's phone buzzed. A message from her university advisor. Her thesis defense had been approved. She'd finished her degree remotely, supported by a man who'd somehow understood that her dreams mattered as much as her safety, who'd hired tutors and arranged her schedule, and never once suggested she should give up the goals she'd carried across an ocean. "Good news?" Joon-Ryeol asked, reading her expression. "The best." She showed him the message, and his smile widened with genuine pride. "Dr. Clarke has a nice ring to it. It's still 2 years away. Then we have 2 years to plan the celebration." He shifted Kai to one arm and wrapped the other around her waist, pulling her close. Amina looked up at him, heart suddenly racing. A double celebration? He reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out a small velvet box. Even Kai went quiet, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Joon-Ryeol said softly, "I know we've done everything backwards. You came here as a maid. You became my conscience, my advisor, my family, and somewhere in the..." Chaos, you became the reason I want to build something better than an empire of fear. He opened the box, revealing a ring with a stone that caught the light like dragon scales. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that monsters can learn to be men when they have the right reason. Amina's vision blurred with tears, but she was smiling. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Kai clapped his hands, not understanding but celebrating anyway, and Joon-Ryeol kissed her while their son laughed between them. In the garden where peonies bloomed and dragons found peace, the most unlikely family became exactly what they'd always needed to be: complete. If this story left you breathless, you're in the right place. Seoul Underworld Stories is where dangerous men meet their match, and love rewrites every rule. Hit subscribe because next week, a debt collector's daughter becomes collateral until the loan shark decides she's worth more than money. Drop a comment. Would you fall for someone the world calls a monster? See you in the shadows.